Hi, thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm Erin Taylor, the Director of Strategic Initiatives at Wholechain, and we're excited to be here with the Global Seafood Alliance to host today's session again, which is part of our ongoing webinar series on traceability together with GSA. Today's session is all about unpacking why data standardization is becoming a strategic enabler across industries, from seafood to luxury fashion and beyond. So before we dive in, a few quick housekeeping notes. We will be sharing a recording of this presentation after today. GSA always posts these on their YouTube channel, so if you missed any in the past, you can find them there. And also please use the chat box for your questions as we go along, and we will leave time at the end for Q&A. We want this to be interactive, so feel free to drop in your thoughts as we go. But first, to get us kicked off, let's do a little context setting. If you have ever tried to collect data across different suppliers or regions or even different internal systems, you know how messy it can get. This slide shows the root of why that is. We all can be asked the same question, but there can be several different ways and formats to answer it. My name, my birth date, and so on. I can answer those in many ways. So this is where standards come in. Now, when I say standards, you might be thinking of certification or benchmarks, a bar that is set that you have to meet. But today we're talking about standards in the sense of a shared language that defines how information gets structured and exchanged. So everyone in the supply chain, from producers to end buyers, has a consistent way to describe supply chain events. Framework that says, hey, let's all write today's date like it appears in the first bullet, for example. So we actually interact with standards every day without realizing it, maybe. The fact that you can go to any gas station and fill up your car, any make of car, without worrying about the nozzle size or the right gas station, or your ability to connect to Wi-Fi in any number of places, including where you are right now, or use your credit card at a machine halfway across the world, all of that works because behind the scenes, systems are speaking the same language. And so in traceability, our goal is to bring that same simplicity and interoperability to supply chains. When we standardize, things just work together regardless of the software, the supplier, the region, and so on. So our panel today brings together a comprehensive picture of all of this in action. GS1 is the group behind the barcode that is being scanned on millions of products every day. And GS1's EPCIS standard defines how to capture and share supply chain events and is the foundation for a lot of the standardization work happening globally. The Global Dialogue on Seafood Traceability adapted EPCIS specifically for seafood, and other sectors are now following suit, which is something that we at Wholechain have seen firsthand as we help to develop a data framework for beef and leather, which is something that Tapestry is now one of the companies moving forward. They're driving that forward. So standardization is the path to scalable sector-wide traceability in seafood and beyond. And what we've really seen as the traceability work has unfolded across commodities is that no matter what you're producing, shrimp or handbags or animal feed, the core challenges are very similar. Long, fragmented supply chains with commingling and transformation events that can obscure a product's journey, multiple product origins that just create the spaghetti of data tracking and high data volumes, a disconnect with producers that really decreases the leverage upstream for getting data, data silos from proprietary systems, and so on. So many other parallels that emerge when we're talking about these different commodities. And so how can standardization help with all of these issues I just mentioned? Well, there's a lot of benefits listed here, but let me just summarize this by saying that the real power of standardization is that it makes traceability invisible in the best way possible. So when standards are working, the functions they enable fade into the background. And that's the point. You stop spending energy translating formats or reconciling systems or tracking down which system you need for which customer, and you start focusing on insights, improvements, and impact. That is how standardization turns traceability from a headache into a strategic asset for a business. So without further ado, and I believe I can turn, does that bring it back to just us, I hope, and take down the slides. It's time to hear directly from those leading the charge on this work. First, Tim Grothier, Vice President of Information Technology at GSA, who's been instrumental in launching the new PRISM platform that leverages GDST and GS1 data standards to bring audit and traceability data together in a single source of assurance. Next, Earl Shank, Senior Manager of Traceability at Tapestry, the parent company of iconic brands like Coach and Kate Spade, New York, who brings a unique perspective from the sewn goods and luxury fashion industries and leads the charge on Tapestry's commitment to achieve 95% traceability and mapping of raw materials by 2025. We also have Gina Morgan, Vice President of Standards at GS1 US. Gina has been with GS1 for over 20 years and has worked with various industries, consortiums, and technical communities in defining and deploying the very data standards that underpin this interoperability that we're talking about across sectors. And Hugh Thomas, Executive Director at the Global Dialogue on Seafood Traceability, who has been leveraging his career spanning nearly 30 years in the seafood world to lead GDST in achieving its vision of a world where universally adopted digital traceability promotes trust in seafood supply chains. So with that, let's dive in with our panel. Just starting with a question for all of you, or any of you who wants to jump in. Considering the framing of common challenges across sectors that we just saw, tell us a bit more about how you see a particular challenge that persists across sectors and what role standards play in solving it. And please feel free to jump in any order that you feel called to.
I'll jump in. So thank you, Erin, and thank you everybody for joining today, and thank you panelists for joining as well. I don't see an individual challenge. I more see them as broad topics. And the reason why is because we hear things like cost of implementation, access to systems and hardware, digitization. But the interesting thing is that each sector almost has an unspoken belief that these topics and others are unique to that sector. But in reality, it's a broad pattern that's the same regardless of the sector that you're viewing or thinking about. In actuality, it's a byproduct of introducing and disrupting technology like digital traceability. Standards address these patterns by introducing a consistency and a common language. The credit card example that you mentioned, Erin, you use the same card to make purchases in the US as you would in Europe. You want to obtain a different card to make a purchase in a different currency. That's only possible because of the standards behind the scenes. Using that example, standardization simplifies the purchasing experience and creates a reduced cost for customers, retailers, and banks because there's that single card and the single infrastructure supporting it. If you needed a separate card for each sector of the world, then you as a customer that travels would have multiple cards, retailers would need support for those, and banks would also need to be able to process that. Tying it back to traceability and standards, the logic is the same. So through speaking the same language and using a standard, providers become more competitive, customers have the freedom of choice, and there's a clear path for what to digitize. With any pattern, once it's realized, you can apply the same logic over and over. So with these patterns, and when they're demonstrated across sectors, it's logical to apply a solution from one sector to the next.
Awesome.
Here. I would concur. In fact, I was saying that when I was on mute. So I would say it's spot on. We work with a number of different industries at GS1 US and have, just as part of some of this work, ventured in upstream, which we kind of look at a little bit differently from GS1's core constituency, which is usually at the finished product. But it's funny, in my, it's over like 27 years now, Erin, but in my time at GS1, every industry believes that they are unique and does it differently, right? But what we found, and in the development of our system of standards, is you can have a core that everybody, it is the same and it is consistent. Part of the challenge is in making sure that folks feel heard, but in convincing them that the core has to be the same across in order for these types of things to scale. And then you might have to layer on a unique vocabulary for a particular industry. For example, like a catch zone isn't necessarily appropriate for a strawberry field and things like that. But that vocabulary can change while the core foundation of the standard and the interfaces that support things are consistent across. So it's really working with industry to understand that. So I appreciate, Tim, very much what you shared with the group.
From a seafood point of view, I think one of the challenges that we recognise, and I think it's faced across many food commodities, is that traceability has been a topic and a product around for 30, 40 years, and has been legislated for from a food safety point of view. Who have I bought my product from and who have I sold it to? And so when you initially start talking to people about standardized traceability, they say, well, I do it already. I've got that. I have food traceability within my supply chain. But actually what we're trying to talk about is how do you get the other data sets, the other information that you may need, whether it's seafood sustainability, whether it's labour and human rights, whether it's environmental degradation, more about provenance for your products. That's the sort of information that you may have in your supply chain, but it's in lots of different formats, lots of different languages and nomenclature. And when you then think about the digitization of that, you really need the standardization, the nomenclature, the format, and then the communications protocol to get your arms around it and take it away. And so one of the challenges that we've found from a GDST point of view is lots of people have said to us, well, we've got traceability. You know, why do we need to engage in the standardization process? And then when you explain to them the opportunities that it affords them, then of course the conversation develops from there.
I think just following on Hugh, I've found that there's almost a duality to the data insofar as, on one hand, it's not so complex. These are data fields and data elements that suppliers are collecting, they're aware of, they're familiar with. But to Hugh's point, you can have these conversations where folks are under the impression that there is alignment, and then you get off those calls and you start to put into effect trying to collect and consolidate that data, and the complexity becomes immediately apparent because there is a lack of alignment. Yes, you have the data, but it's off over in left field in a format that isn't structured in a usable manner. And so I, of course, know this from the luxury space, but the standardization piece, the way to sort of take that duality of, simplicity not really meeting the need because of the complexity without the standard, and making it so that you have these really clean ways of using data across supply chains.
Awesome. Great. Thanks, everybody. And actually, Earl, if we could stay with you for a minute, based on how you have been engaging with this work, you really are someone who sees that value of data standardization. So why is this so critical from your perspective? You started to speak to it, but just tell us more from your perspective in the industry you're in.
Yeah, absolutely. So I didn't mention it, but thanks for having me and having Tapestry join this call. We're a bit of the outsiders talking about luxury handbags and the luxury space and how this all relates to our work and the way that we're thinking about topics like deforestation and managing impact upstream in our leather specific supply chains. But what we deal with, and I'm sure there's commonalities across other sectors as well, is as a brand, we have hundreds of suppliers who we are sourcing from or nominating as either finished goods factories or raw material suppliers into our supply chain. On the flip side of this, the suppliers that we work with very commonly have a multitude of brands or downstream buyers that they're also engaging with. And so this is where that sort of spaghetti of data requests starts to emerge, where on the brand side, you're pulling or trying to pull data or ask for data. And on the supplier side, you start to hear things about how burdensome it's become to provide all of the data that they're being asked for in all types of different formats, albeit even when the data is very similar or even the same, right? The proprietary systems that different brands or different downstream buyers are using makes all of this very complicated. And so that's where we've really seen an opportunity and started to dig in on data standardization, trying to really leverage a lot of the learnings that are present here in the seafood space that have been gained by I don't want to say error, but certainly trial and figuring this all out. I think we we had sort of an aha moment at a point along our journey where we said, moving away from that uniqueness bias, hey, somebody else who's at least similar enough has done this. What can we learn from that? How can we apply it? And so we started to format and figure out, is there a draft kind of data standard relevant to beef and cattle that we can deploy into our own supply chains to start to figure out, does this data exist? Can it be formatted? Can we make the case to our suppliers? And I think the last thing I'll say on this is, in my mind, there's really two buckets of things that happen a lot of times when we're engaging with suppliers and asking them to do things. There's the bucket of, we need you to gather and format and input data. And then there's the bucket of actually transforming the way that they're doing things that, of course, the data can reflect, but is really the work of the work, whatever that means, whether it's the elimination of deforestation, whether it's a reduction of impact on how they're producing or sourcing material. And so I bring that up because, to the extent that we can reduce the burden, in my mind at least, of all of that data gathering and organization and input, I think it frees up more room to do the work that we really care about and that we're trying to measure and report on and talk about. And so I think that's a really exciting thing, is if we can spend less time in our supply chains collecting the data or formatting the data, doing all of the transformation of the data, it means we can do more of the things that we're really trying to measure with all of that data.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Earl. I think it's always good to hear an end buyer being conscious of reducing the burden on the supply chain, and also might be surprising to folks here to think about, as a brand, there's leverage maybe, but actually, just for the audience here thinking about things, leather is actually a byproduct, and so of the cattle industry. And so in terms of leverage and some of these things, it's a really unique position and some interesting challenges that Earl and the entire industry have to think through. So appreciate those perspectives. And maybe we can dive a little bit more, Earl, into how Tapestry is facilitating the use of standardized traceability to connect what's happening upstream to your brand commitments and consumer expectations.
Absolutely. So I started to touch on it a bit. We, going back about 12 to 18 months, really started to dig into the EPCIS based model of event-based traceability, and said, can we deploy this? Can we kind of leverage these teams that have worked in the seafood space to tailor and configure the request so that it is specific enough that the leather folks and the beef folks will get these requests, but that sort of leverages those learnings. And so what we went in doing is not really knowing whether this would work. We acknowledged, hey, we're not so unique, we can't try, but maybe we are so unique that we find out it doesn't work. And we started to test this with some of our suppliers upstream in the supply chain. We built a fairly basic tool to deploy this. We didn't want to spend a ton of time trying to implement systems, get suppliers set up with credentials. We felt like that, frankly, an Excel-based tool was sufficient to test and learn. And when we went out to suppliers, we sort of put this ask out that when it comes to inputting the data, once they understood all of the details around that, and there was definitely some coaching and training on it, let us know, is this data that you have? Is this data that you don't have? Or is this data within that bucket of you don't have that you could get? And use that as a way to sort of guide us in understanding how realistic this request is. Because, for going down this path, and as excited as we were also realistic. We knew that these sorts of problems hadn't been solved previously, and we knew a lot of smart people had been thinking about them. And so we sort of were apprehensive all along the way, thinking, I'm sure that the shoe's going to drop. We're going to find out where this doesn't work in these cattle supply chains. And I think, fortunately, we had a lot of success. We found that in many instances, at least, the data did exist. It was formatted differently. It was formatted and existed for different reasons than we were asking the questions. When it came to engaging at the farm level, these farmers and ranchers, they hadn't been asked by leather companies for this type of data, but for their own purposes and by some national regulation, they were tracking the type of data that we needed already. And so it ended up being quite exciting when we got our first tranche of data back, and we were able to sort of upload it into a visualization tool where you could see it and bring this data to life, because it is really technical. There's a lot of geo coordinates and animal weights and key tracking event data points that are coming through. And at some point you're like, did we get it all? Do we have enough to make sense of it? And then when you upload it into a tool that shows the movement, shows the location of animals over their lifespan, shows how those all sort of start to round up. I like to say, and I give my sister credit for this, everybody loves a map. So when you put this information on a map and you bring it to life, it really shows what you have and the value of that. And then when you start to talk about measuring impact and understanding that impact is location specific, when we're talking about deforestation, it's very location specific. It really starts to breathe life into this work. And so we've been quite pleased, and we're excited to continue to roll that out across our supply chain. And I think just as importantly, talking to our peers and talking to suppliers that we don't even work with, and starting to encourage and saying, I think we've got something here. We need to band together. This is the opportunity to avoid all of that additional work of everybody does their own thing. Let's use this as a time where we kind of come together around this sort of approach. And maybe we don't have it exactly right in these drafts that we've started to deploy, but there's certainly some really critical learnings that I think can inform some next steps for the cattle, both beef and leather side of the industry.
Awesome. Thanks, Earl. No, it is really exciting to see when the proof of concept comes to life, and it has the real potential and path towards scalability behind it. So thank you for that. Gina, maybe we can turn to you. I would love to, kind of dive in a bit more. GS1 is so foundational to interoperability, and I mentioned the EPCIS standard. So tell us a little bit more. How does EPCIS support traceability across different industries and supply chains?
Sure. EPCIS is a standard that's about 18 years old now. So in the standards world, you don't look for instant gratification. It takes some time for these things to take hold, but it is one of our GS1's share standards. We have our standards fit into 3 buckets: identification, data capture, and data sharing. And essentially, at its core, it's 2 interface standards: a data capture standard and a data query standard, so that you can then share across different trading partners. And it really was the first standard that built upon our foundation, a mechanism for users and our members to capture physical event data. So we have a lot of standards that, and our origination point was the standard that allowed you to check out at point of sale with the UPC code. And that standard for the not just the code, but also the scanners was again our origin story. This was one of the first standards that took everything else that we have as part of our portfolio of standards, put it together so that you could really visualize the supply chain and in a way that was kind of evidentiary of what just occurred. Versus you might have an advanced ship notice that says, I'm about to ship you this, but the difference with EPCIS is there was a trigger point of an identified thing that created this physical event. And it really, as I mentioned, is just evidentiary of what is happening in the supply chain. So it just provided a light into what was happening that we believe has just introduced a level of visibility that's unparalleled. So it is, as I mentioned, kind of foundational at an interface level. And then you will see things, and we anticipate and have experienced different application standards, so to speak, which take our system of standards and then have another one. GDST is an example of it, that then take all of those parts and pieces and make it applicable for a particular segment. And it sounds like Tapestry has done something similar for the beef and cattle industry, and that's great. That means we have a sound foundation of sharing standards.
Yeah, thanks for that. And it's there's a number of pieces to the GS1 ecosystem that folks are probably more familiar with than they may think. I think one that comes up in the seafood industry a lot is the GTIN, or Global Trade Identification Number, because folks are often asked for that by a buyer. So, adding to kind of the picture that you're building, can you share why that is a significant piece of the puzzle? Nope, we may have frozen moment. No problem. Well, we can come back to Gina's questions. Maybe Hugh, happy to switch to you here. GDST has really helped lead a shift in seafood towards standardized data sharing. So what are you seeing in terms of adoption and impact?
Yeah, it's been a real journey that GDST has been on. You know, we've gone through several iterations ourselves in terms of how we engage and understand the industry needs. You know, it started off with the view that would create a KDE, a key data element set with aligned to critical tracking events, and everybody must do everything. It's certainly become clear that those journeys are individual from businesses, and that they need to be allowed to choose which key data elements, which critical tracking events are suitable for their supply chains and their needs. And I think that's been quite key. The other thing that's really changed in terms of adoption is I think people have come to a realization that currently traceability information is historic. And what it means is that they make commitments to their brands, to their customers in policies, and that when seafood arrives at certain points in supply chains, there's certain attributes already associated with them, and it's too late. They don't have the opportunity to change it, and it creates compromise. And that actually, if you then build up your information at each event, and that's digitized and it's shared in near real time, or in as timely a manner as it needs to be, that people then have the opportunity to warrant that information and make informed purchasing decisions as they go through. And so there's been a sort of shift and a realization with people that whilst adopting digital interoperable traceability and aligning their supply chains and making the investment into getting people adopting the standardized nomenclature and format is a challenge, it also brings huge benefits once you start seeing that go through. And the other thing that I think we've seen a groundswell, certainly in the last sort of 6 to 12 months, is people realizing that actually technology itself is not the intent. It will never deliver the intent. The intent is necessary to be delivered, but you also need motivated people, and that we're getting some of the big brands and retailers and people who recognize the value of standardized data saying, look, this is important, including governments. We recognize that industry creates a lot of information and data that we need to inform our decision-making process, but conversely, it's a route to market. We've got import control rules that we need to satisfy, and that it can scratch many itches. And so the motivated people that have been engaged in the early days are those that help create the momentum, and we're now starting to see that translate through, and really it's then about holding people's hands and creating that community for them to move together down the road. And when we fall over and make the mistakes, and Neil mentioned, GDST's probably made some mistakes in the past. Yes, we have, and I'm sure there's other dead ends and bumps we're going to go to, but that's part of the journey that we're on. And really it's taking that foundation that GS1 has provided and afforded us to take forward.
Great, thanks, Hugh. And pulling it into these folks and other sectors, can you expand a little bit more on some of those lessons from GDST? It's always great to hear somebody sort of say, yeah, we've made mistakes. So either positive or negative lessons from GDST that can really apply to other industries facing similar traceability challenges.
Sure. Well, Earl touched on one earlier, Excel spreadsheets. Let's be honest. I think everybody has got information coming into them. In fact, there's a tsunami of data every day that's passed amongst people, and Excel spreadsheets and PDFs are often the foundation of those. And I think GDST's had to realise that Excel spreadsheets are probably always going to be around. We have a huge base of small-scale farmers, fishers, and processors, and that it's very unreasonable to expect them to invest in something that's more than a few dollars to engage in a market in a market movement. So I think recognizing that, as I said, allowing people to have their own journey. And as I say to people, they have to justify to themselves, their peers, their customers, and their stakeholders why they make the decision on their traceability journey that they're on. And then it depends at what speed they want to move. And it's not our job to criticize people for that. Our job is to provide the framework, the opportunity to succeed, and to try and get it done as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And I think the other thing is to say that we've also struggled in that data is applicable to everybody, and so everybody has an insight and an input. And part of the challenge we've had is how do we communicate the value, the benefits, the need to motivate people to getting engaged, depending on whichever lens they get to. And so that's probably also been some of the other things that we've had to learn, is that it is a horse for a course, and sometimes we have to accept that people are at different speeds and different levels, and that's fine. And as long as we can see that momentum forward, then that's positive for the public benefit, which, especially from a seafood point of view, where you've got a public resource, is a real driver for everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Hugh. Gina, I think that's sort of a good transition point back to you after your fantastic mic drop moment there. Oh, that's so good.
I mean, Atlanta. Sorry about that, you guys.
No, it's all good. It totally happens. But yeah, thinking of these insights across sectors, obviously GS1 has a ton of them as well. Can you reflect a bit more on what's worked and also where the biggest opportunities are for individual companies thinking about this?
Sure. I think, as I mentioned, the standard EPCIS is over 18 years old. And so it has taken, we like to say, I've talked to some folks at Wholechain about this, that it was a standard before its time. But it really, I would say, began to take shape, and with our pharmaceutical industry in the US. There was a regulatory driver, to be sure, to have chain of custody information be able to be shared across that supply chain. It's the Drug Secure Supply Chain Act, or DSCSA. And so we worked with industry over a decade on that. And from the time in which that regulation was passed, industry actually came to us to say, we've got to standardize around this. We don't want market lock-in, vendor lock-in, those types of things. So how can we create leverage the GS1 system of standards, which also was used for unique identification down to the serial level, as well as a specific data carrier. And then this data language for physical event data was what that industry wanted to galvanize around. And so we worked quite a bit. And I think, Hugh, you might appreciate this, to develop this application standard that the pharmaceutical industry could work towards, to say, this is how we comply, or these are the necessary parts of this puzzle to comply from an identification standpoint, a data capture standpoint, in the case of data sharing, to be able to kind of provide that visibility. EPCIS was chosen, and we did, like I mentioned, we had to work with them to say, what's the unique vocabulary for pharma? What are those critical tracking events? How might it differ a bit from just finished good apparel? And so walking through all of those different use cases, and then understanding the regulatory requirements, which is also a challenge always. It takes some time. I'm not going to say it took a decade to do that, but it did. There were milestones within that that we worked with industry on. And I think you made such a valid point. You could put all of that together, but you also have to make it scalable to all at each level. So in the case of pharma, down to the mom and pop pharmacy shop, how can they participate in this data sharing thing using standards and technology that support it? And then I would also say, and to your last part of your question, what's in it for me? What's in it for you is you're not going to go to jail because you'll be complying with the regulation. That's part of it. But we always ensure, what we try to do is say, this can also bring you benefit inside your organization. And people don't really get that until they start to play with the data and see the data, and then can apply that to their internal operations to say, oh, wait, if I could see this at this granular level, at this particular location, and I might now be able to see when something moves from, the back room to the shelf, or the manufacturing line to the staging area. That could give me some intelligence, whether it be for robotics and automation or order fulfillment, that just simply didn't have before. And so those are the learnings that I would say we have taken from the last decade in working with the pharmaceutical industry in this area.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and definitely the effort has been massive with that industry, and it's been leading, and we've referenced it in a lot of ways since then. I think, to your point about kind of once you finally dig into the data and see the value of it, Tim, GSA has recently launched Prism, and that really kind of gets to that point of getting into the data and leveraging it in a certain way. So how does Prism reflect this value on standards and using standards for business benefit?
Yeah, thank you, Erin. We place a high value on standards. We create the best aquaculture practices and the best seafood practices standards. But in the context of this conversation, it took on a new meaning for us with the creation of Prism. At the outset, we knew that Prism had to be interoperable and work with varying systems. But the best way to do that is to use standards, but we had to design it in such a way that we could work with varying data sets. So that necessitated identifying which data standards we wanted to work with. The first of which was actually not anything related to traceability. It was related to just two computers talking to each other through a thing called APIs. APIs are application programming interfaces. And it's very common in the software world and has been around for a number of years at this point. But we identified the data standard called JSON, which is JavaScript Object Notation. So any data sent to and from the APIs of Prism will need to be in JSON format. So getting that put aside, the second was using GDST and EPCIS, primarily because we knew we wanted to interact with traceability data and have that augment our audit data. The reason why we selected GDST and EPCIS is primarily because we wanted to remain provider agnostic. The traceability provider space is a growing space, and to lock into a single provider, we didn't see that being a longevity route. And the GDST offered us the opportunity to create the ability and also create a system where we can query a laundry list of different providers through the data standard. And Prism can query any GDST verified capable solution.
Great, thanks for that. And as the one overseeing all things technology within GSA, how do you see the role of technology really evolving to help companies of all sizes comply with the slew of traceability demands that are being faced today?
To Gina's earlier comment, standards take time, and they take time to develop and morph. But I do see technology solutions adopting standards more and more as that time progresses. Over the course of that time, I see these solution providers and the solutions themselves having standards as part of the default offering. And these providers and the solutions will actually start to no longer highlight the fact that the standard itself is a selling point. It's just there. It's standard. It's part of the package. But within this shift is actually going to cause more of a value add to the customers, and also create a differentiation for themselves. And their competitors are actually going to start seeing this, recognizing it, and it's going to create a shift for all of the different technology providers, in the sense that it'll create competitive pricing. It'll create a feature competition, if you will, because it's no longer about trying to get their data in. It's about really trying to get their solution in at that point. The data will move because of the standard, and the topic is addressed at that point. now the focus shifts to how can I get my solution to be a part of what you do.
Got it. Super clear. That makes sense. I'm seeing some great questions come in the chat. We're going to switch to the Q&A in just a couple minutes, but just one more question kind of across the group. And we started to go into this a little bit, but what practical advice would you all give a company in this greater context of standards and what we've been talking about? For any company just starting its traceability journey, or that's on it, but might be facing a slew of these internal and external barriers in their journey towards standardization, how would you guide them? And again, that question is just open to any.
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off. The first really is to actually take the time to map your supply chain, identify what information you need to know and where you want it to be collected. There are lots of people that haven't considered the events within their supply chains, and so that's the first stage, and I would encourage anybody to start on that, or to relook at it if they haven't already done it. The second thing is then to decide exactly what you want to know at each stage and define that and be clear and be consistent. Then decide how you want that data sending and receiving. Do you want to maintain what you've got? Do you want to adopt something new? Is it cloud-based? Is it blockchain? Is it a combination of that's already there? I would say, of course, the capability to be compliant with the GDST standard, which of course includes the communications protocol and the EPCIS and JSON and all the necessary needs from an information technology point of view, and then decide the scope and the timeline over which you want to do it. And many businesses have either come and said, we're going to start doing all that and say nothing about it to start with. Some have made public commitments to their supply chains on discrete products and commodities and move from there. But really, it's just actually just make a decision and take the first step, because until you take the first step, you haven't started. And actually, you're going backwards because everyone else is moving forward. So really, it's just giving some time. And then I think the other thing then is just to say, realize that there's several steps then within that journey that you have to take and be honest to really wring the benefits of standardized digital interoperable traceability, and then decide how far you want to go.
So I'll dovetail onto what Hugh said, because there's a lot to unpack there for sure. And a lot of organizations, individuals, they start to become overwhelmed with the gravity of it and the enormity that it can be. And I would just offer a little nugget that Hugh threw in there. Just start somewhere. Try not to look at the entirety of the effort, and instead just focus on one tangible thing to move forward. Then move iteratively and just build on the last step.
I would add, from the perspective of maybe an industry that's less mature in terms of using this type of standard or deploying it widely. I would add that I think it's really key for organizations to have greater understanding of EPCIS and these types of frameworks. It's quite seductive when the platform and service providers come and they pitch this solution that's going to be your silver bullet that's going to solve your problems. But I sort of think of that like hiring a builder before you have a blueprint, and then hoping the best that they're going to deliver on whatever project that you're talking about. Like it is really critical to build that internal knowledge and expertise and understanding, at least where we are in the own good space for now, until we hopefully get to a point of standardization, so that rather than trying to engage with I can't remember if it was Tim or Hugh that brought this up, the technology that can certainly support this, that you're actually engaging with the underpinnings of what that technology can kind of enable through all of this, so that you don't kind of get the cart out in front of the horse on it all.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Earl, and appreciated so much all of the pieces and parts that you laid out. And that's how we guide industry whenever we might be trying to work with them to develop their own application standard. Let's map the supply chain first and foremost, and then break it all down into the parts and of the critical tracking events and the key data elements within. I will say what is important that you point out, Earl, is you need to ensure whatever solution you are looking towards is truly standards based. And there's a lot of ways to get sucked into that. And it isn't, but understanding what is in that standard and what is really critical to ensure the interoperability across the supply chain I mean, I'm not saying you need to go read the however many page long spec, but there are some key parts that you just want to ensure any solution that you have include, and that it is based on those standards.
Super great points. And I speak from a personal standpoint that there's lots of great resources on everything we've been talking about in terms of each of these organizations having put out things to go and start to learn and build up capacity. And even if it's a more mature industry, according to your perspective, Earl, I think that holds true of still being knowledgeable enough to know how to sift through all of these different things. So that's still really important. So maybe just transitioning to some of the audience questions here, since we've had a few come in, and again, please continue to share in the chat. I want to go back up to one that Joe Lasbrigada brought to us a few minutes ago. Probably a question for Hugh. With G10s and required traceability lock codes, how does the additional layer of GDST provide additional benefits to the system as a whole?
Yeah, great question, Joe. Simply, GDST has to actually adapt itself. So it has to be applicable to specific market requirements. It started as a standard nominally to address illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing, which was really seen as the simple step for a global seafood industry to lay its hat on. We've then moved to something that's really scratching the itch of food safety, which is the one up, one down piece. And then we're moving into a place now where there's general commodity interest and system capability is important from the US point of view, where there are shipping events that really need multiple key data elements embedded within them. That's an iteration of the GDST standard that we need to put in as an interim step. At the moment, it's about each of the key data elements being passed along and being able to be said is present and available, and that's there for you to pull. And we recognise that with some of the legacy systems that people use within distribution and transport, that they're not necessarily fit for purpose to take the breadth of the digital data that's available to them. And so that's something that as a standard holder, we recognise we need to make a change to our standard, put in a shipping event that will have a set of key data elements embedded within it. That doesn't really fit the core standard or the EPCIS standard as it stands at the minute, but it's a necessary step to achieve the means to an end. And so that's something that we're aware of and we're working on. But then again, it'll also mean for the future that as more expansion frameworks for key data elements are added, and there's greater options for people to choose what information they want associated with different movements of their products. And again, we may look to build on that and apply it going forward. So at the moment, it is a challenge from a GDST point of view. We recognise that, and we're going to have to make an amendment to the standard to allow embedding of key data elements in shipping events and that sort of thing to meet the source lock codes and that sort of thing that's required from a US market point of view.
Great, thanks, Hugh. I'm seeing one from Fabian. Should electronic traceability be mandatory for the next BAP standard? I'm going to say this is probably a Tim question.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you, Fabian. So currently, traceability is mandatory inside of our product identity module. Electronic traceability, that is not within my purview in terms of how our standards are developed. I'm the technology guy. But I am more than happy to bring that back to our program integrity team and follow up with you, Fabian.
Great, thanks, Tim. The next one from Chintamani. Do we have any software or any app for real-time data to capture the shrimp culture? I would say that kind of speaking to some of what's been discussed here today, I'll put a link in the chat about the GDST verified capable solutions. Oh my goodness, the formatting of this is not going well. Hopefully that will display correctly. That might show up a little funny, but you let me know if that's not accessible. So that's one thing I would point to, is that these are the systems that are able to be traceability solutions that have been verified by the GDST as meeting interoperability. And then I guess I would also say, I'm not sure fully the context of this question, but in terms of, there's a number of on the ground software that are collecting data from a shrimp farm, for example. So sensors and electronic, monitoring, things like that. So if you're looking to kind of interface those software applications with a traceability system, again, this is where interoperability or an API is going to be important to have in place. That's something Wholechain has, I can speak to. Welcome to have you reach out and we can share just broadly about the landscape of what that might look like. So hope that helps.
Can I give a plug as well, Aaron?
Yeah, please.
And just a reminder, our Prism platform currently can work with any one of those listed solutions.
Perfect.
Yeah, and just to quickly add, certainly the focus from a GDST point of view has been on software solutions. We do have several hardware providers who have approached GDST who have software embedded within them, because they recognize that they need to also have capable software if they are capturing data and digital data, so that it can be passed along the supply chain. And so, we've got, I think there's 8 solutions on the list of verified capable. There's 14 additional solutions that are currently working towards capability, and there's another 75 plus who have spoken to us, which includes some hardware providers, whether that's at farm level or whether that's fishing vessel or within the supply chain. So, something that Tim talked about earlier was about having standards embedded in our everyday life. And our vision really is that by sort of 2030, software and hardware is just put into the marketplace that's GDST capable, and people don't have to worry about it. The data is just captured and able to be sent and received that meets the needs. And so GDST's job is done in that regard.
Perfect. Thanks, you. We just have one coming in from Scott Zimmerman. Hi, Scott. Today, I saw an example where a finished product label stated that the shrimp was produced in one area, but the receiving record for raw material stated that it was sourced in a different area. Will software eventually be capable of reducing this kind of human error? And will AI eventually be used to audit records to reduce these types of events? I will leave it open to the floor, but happy to jump in on this too.
Yeah, I don't want to dominate the conversation, but certainly if you look at the journey from GDST, it's about identifying your data, it's about complete data, it's about valid data, is it the right data in the right box? And then it's about data veracity, the truthfulness of that data. And we're already seeing providers working at the veracity end of it. And we've seen third-party standards, and GSA is one of them, who are exploring their chain of custody and saying, how can we use standardized digital data? How can we look for non-compliances and then really target our work into areas where the veracity of it says, this doesn't seem right, we need to have a closer look at it. And so logically, machine learning and artificial intelligence will lead to that, but you can only really exploit the artificial intelligence once you've got standardized data that's being presented to them.
Yeah, just adding on to that, in current day, there's varying types of solutions and ways that you can create traceability. We're a partner with Wholechain, and they are a preferred provider for us. And there's detail within their solutioning that I think everyone should be aware of. And they use blockchain technology. The nature of a blockchain is you cannot modify data along the chain. And some providers don't have that capability. And that gets back to what Hugh was saying, where it gets to the veracity of the data and then also validity. Providers are growing into that capability, but not all providers are there yet. And if the data itself cannot be validated or verified, AI is going to have no capability there, because you need high quality, high valid data for AI to be able to produce positive results. So eventually, yes, I do think it will get there, as well as automation and various layers, but I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah, great. Thanks both. Since we have just a few minutes left, I just want to send it back to each one of our panelists one more time, maybe to just leave us with one final takeaway from this panel. So maybe Gina, if you have anything you'd like to jump in with.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having us here, and to the seafood community and our latest in the beef and cattle space. I just want to say appreciate all of the efforts to move towards standardized data models, to all of the work that you all are doing to ensure that people understand the necessity of that for interoperability, which leads to solution choice, which makes it scalable and affordable for most. Thank you. I would say one of the questions and one of the things that we're focused on in an organization is how do we actually scale upstream to that small farmer or to that fisherman or that cattle farmer, and how can we make the foundations of our system of standards more accessible, whether that be from our identification system to tools and resources that they might be able to use, understanding all of the limitations that come with that. But it's an area that we're clearly that we're super focused on, and part of the reason is that we are seeing the regulations coming out all around the globe. We're a global standards organization, and feel like that is really a focus that we need to hang tight on. So thank you all for all of your efforts in each of your different industries, and we are as the largest supply chain standards organization in the world, and that system of standards being what it is, we stand ready to partner with all of you.
Perfect. Thanks, Gina. Earl, maybe you next. Your final takeaway for us.
Absolutely. Thanks, Aaron. And again, thanks for having Tapestry join this as a bit of the outsider. I think my key takeaway is interoperability and traceability. Interoperable traceability is really the enabler. It's come up a lot. I think it's the enabler in terms of the flow of data, which then enables the measurement and management of the impact. But I think as Tim and Hugh and Gina throughout got into, it also unlocks these other technology add-ons, right? That interoperability, that standardization enables the APIs, it enables the AI, it enables the blockchain to flow between or act as a ledger between systems. So it really becomes that foundation that then everything else can be built on top of. And without that foundation, you start to have these sort of like rocky things, the technology, the claims, the assurances around what you think you know about your data. So I think if you can lock that in, it starts to become the unlock for a lot of other things.
Perfect. Thanks, Joel. How about Hugh?
I'm going to be cheeky and say three things. First is thank you to GSA and Wholechain for inviting GDST on the panel. The second thing is to say that the GS1 EPCIS and the GDST standards are not mutually exclusive. It's not a choice. I think people need to think about the broader commodity piece from a GS1 point of view, and then look at the specificity of the GDST standard that builds on that. And then the third thing to say is, I'm really pleased that the seafood industry is probably at the moment ahead of many of the commodities. It's a journey. We're going to make mistakes, but please come on it with us and come with open arms and understand that we need help and support, and that we'll get it right, and it will be for the benefit of everybody when we get there at the end. So thank you all very much.
Thanks, Hugh. Well said. Tim?
We've said data a lot throughout this conversation, and I think that's kind of the foundation of a large part of what we've been talking about. So I would put the notion out there, just think about what is the quality of your data, How scalable is it? How well can you work with it individually, as an organization, as an industry? And really put some deep thought into, can you improve it? Can you take incremental steps at really trying to move towards that digitization? Because having a pen and paper is data, but is that data that you can actively work with in this ecosystem? Can you take that first step to moving it to a spreadsheet like Earl highlighted, and then move it into something that can move through APIs using a framework like GDST or GS1 and EPCIS, and then using some of those frameworks and layouts that everyone talked about. But start with data and think about it.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. I echo all reflections here, and just to say this isn't theory. Standards are already working across seafood, fashion, retail, and so much more. And our goal is to continue growing that. So I know we're at time. Thank you so much to the Global Seafood Alliance for hosting us. Huge thanks to each one of you panelists for your time, and to the audience for tuning in. Again, the recording will be shared after this, and stay tuned for the next in the webinar series. So thanks all.